Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for being with us once again. We are here with Savannah. We are talking about legacy environmental justice. And on this particular episode, we are diving deep into Kodak. Kodak is the company at the center of our discussion about legacy environmental justice because my good friend Savannah has very intimate knowledge. Savannah is from Rochester, and I cannot wait to learn more about Kodak and its impact on the community. But we got to start somewhere, so we're going to start with Kodak. Savannah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. So I feel like it used to be that Kodak was one of those household names that everybody knew about back in the 80s, have you? But since it's, gone bankrupt in the recent years, Kodak has just faded into obscurity. But I feel like first we have to understand what the heck Kodak made, what the heck it does, and what it is now today as well. Because even though it is bankrupt, it still is out there, and so people are still familiar with it in some senses, even if you're not, born prior to, to the 2000s.
Yep, nope, you're absolutely right. I remember, I'm obviously much older than you are, but Kodak was the thing. You had a Kodak camera, you took Kodak pictures, everything was Kodak. And obviously for people who are much younger than me, my children, people in college, I guess this generation, because of all the digital things that have been going on, the way that we do things now, Kodak isn't really much of a thing at all. And I'm not even sure if people even know what Kodak is, and so, or even what they did. So the idea of a picture on film that you print and you frame and you post somewhere, or not post, you hang up on the wall. We post things online, but you would hang up something on the wall. We might have to start there first. So before we even talk about Kodak as a company, like what did they actually do and make, and how important was that in the time that they made it?
Definitely. So Kodak made film and cameras. So first, got to understand how film works. So film is essentially there's a piece of plastic, and then on top of that plastic is a gelatine emulsion. And that emulsion contains silver halide crystals. Those silver halide crystals are what help to make your photograph. So you load a little canister of film into your camera, into your film camera. You click the button. It exposes this camera shutter opens for the briefest second, just to let enough light in so it can imprint an image onto that film. Now, if you look at that film by just taking it out, you'd be like, "There's nothing here," because it's invisible until we, develop the film. So it's called like the latent image until you develop it. You gotta develop it in a dark room. You got a bunch of special chemicals, do some stuff, got to get the silver out of the film. And then after all the developing has happened, you get your image. You have to get the negative as well. So that's kind of how film works in a brief nutshell. But if you want to learn more about film, I'm sure there's some other film podcasts you can listen to or something. But Kodak also made cameras to go with the film. So, for example, they were known for like the little, it's like $10 or so. You get your own little camera. It comes with a little film. You take a bunch of pictures, click, 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 click. And then once you're done, you take the film roll out of it, and then you would send it back to Rochester, New York, where they would develop your images for you, and then they would send them back to you. So it's kind of like a disposable little camera. And they were really, really popular because one, it's cheap, and plus you get a bunch of cameras out of it. Because Kodak's motto was like, you push the button, so you, being the consumer, push the button, get your photo, and then we do the rest. So we, process your image for you, because you can't really develop that image on your own unless you're like, you have your own little darkroom studio, your own little chemicals, you know what you're doing. It's a trade, essentially.
Yeah, and I remember growing up, vacationing was, you always had to buy the disposable camera before you went on vacation. And you would take the camera and it would have a number at the top. And depending on how much money you're willing to spend, that number was bigger. And that number was the number of pictures you could actually take with that camera when you go on vacation. And so what we would do is you would take the camera with you, you take a picture, you look through a little hole, take the picture, crank it a little bit, it clicks, the number goes down, you keep clicking, turning, clicking, turning until you run out of pictures. And then you would take that disposable camera to the local pharmacy and they would take it from you. And in about, I think it was like 3 to 4 days, they would send you a packet of those pictures that you took on vacation. And it was the thing to do. And so everybody had their disposable camera. Everybody had their ways of doing pictures that was cheap. It was quick and it was no hassle because I can't imagine having to develop actual film anywhere. I would never do that. I wouldn't spend the money to try to create a place to do that. So Kodak, when it came, when it had its disposable cameras, its processing equipment, its all of its infrastructure, it became the go-to company for all things picture related. And so that's how they were able to get such a strong foothold just in the marketplace because that service was invaluable to families, to models, to anybody else who wanted to take a picture. It was really, really cool. And so I appreciate the background. I actually didn't know how pictures were actually created with film. I just knew that when you took the thing back, they send you pictures in the mail and hopefully they came out well. And so it's good to get that history on film. But let's transition to history about the company itself, because now we have this juggernaut company in Rochester, New York. Can you tell us how that all happened? How did they even find themselves in upstate New York?
Definitely. So it all started back way in 1889, which is like, yikes, really long ago. So you got this man, his name's George Eastman, and he is the founder of Kodak. So like I mentioned, he founded the company in 1889. It was the Eastman Company. So not Kodak yet. It became the Eastman Kodak Company 3 years later in 1892. And everything started off really, really good. People loved the founder of Kodak, and they also loved the company themselves. Part of the reason they loved Kodak so much is because Kodak cared for its workers, from everything that we can tell, and it also cared for the community. So, for example, with the workers, they got like wage dividends at the end of the year. Now, some of you guys might get wage dividends yourself if your company's doing well, but back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it just was not a thing. Furthermore, they also got like retirement annuities, life insurance, disability benefit plans, all things which were very rare for an employer to be giving their employees back in the day. Furthermore, I mean, George Eastman gave away like 1/3 of his like total holdings to his employees. So he was very popular among his employees and also the community. He donated to the struggling, little university. It was then the Mechanics Institute of Rochester. Now today it's the Rochester Institute of Technology. It's all one Carnegie classification research level 2 institution with like 13,000 students, lots of computer science majors, lots of engineering students actually doing really well. He also helped to fund like a bunch of dental clinics, which I mean, it makes seem like no one really likes going to the dentist, but do you know you got your good teeth, you look good, you're probably gonna have a better future ahead of you because we're biased towards how people look, and if you got a nice shiny roll of pearly white teeth, you're more likely to get further in life. In addition, the man also established like the Eastman School of Music. So, for example, I had a young lady in my high school. She wanted to be an opera singer. She applied right to the Eastman School of Music, to the Juilliard School in New York City, to the Berklee School of Music. All of these are really big names. Grant you, if you're not really into like music, personally, I'm not super into like classical music training. But like if you are, you probably recognize all of these names. These schools all have kind of similar programs to each other, and they're all on like the top list for top music schools in the U.S. And today, the Eastman School of Music is still a really, really top school. And he really helped to, one, cement Kodak into this community because, he's funding the institution. He's helping kids look great with smiley teeth. The workers love him. And then he just continues building the company until the point that we get to, like, it's Kodak's height. They owned about 90% of the American film market, which is huge. 90% is massive. Today it's like infinitesimal because of their bankruptcy, but 90% is just huge. And then we also see this community town start really revolving around Kodak. So we get the foundation of Kodak Park, which was the manufacturing facility that would continue to grow and grow and grow until it became actually the largest photographic product manufacturing facility in the world. I did some research actually, and I wanted to see if anybody had surpassed it. And from as far as I can tell, it is still the biggest ever built. The biggest in the U.S. that's currently functioning, I think, is in like South Carolina by Fujifilm. But it just goes to show that this hasn't been like unrivaled since the day it was finished being built to its total size. So Kodak Park begins to be built in 1890. At its height, it is 200 buildings. It's like 4 miles east to west, and then even longer north to south. It's huge. It has its own power plants. It has its own wastewater treatment facilities. It has its own medical facilities. Its own private rail cars. In a sense, it's like this little baby city inside this larger city that's Rochester, New York. And then because this facility is so huge, there's tons of employees that work in it. So at Kodak Park alone, 30,000 employees worked at Kodak Park. And then in the bigger like Rochester, New York area, we're looking at like 62,000 just for this one company, which is huge. I mean, some global companies today might have 62,000 employees worldwide. Having them all in one city is just massive. So when people like referred to Kodak, it was like, oh, we defer to the great yellow father because Kodak cameras all came in like these like little uniquely yellow colored boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like the mother, the Kodak is the mother. She cares for us. She provides our retirement plans, our jobs, our university. People really loved it, and people didn't really have anything bad to say about it. Part of the reason I suspect is so there was this thing called like they called it like Camp Eastman. It was suspected to be like loyalty training, basically. Don't say anything bad. Don't report any concerns. Everything is fantastic. It's all what is it? Sunshine and rainbows here. There's no problems. And people love Kodak. And then even like during like after the bankruptcy, I remember I was in seventh grade science class, and my science teacher was showing me a video of how they were tearing down one of the Kodak buildings. They actually like kind of like imploded the building because like it wasn't being used anymore, and they wanted to make room for new things. And I remember he was just like so sad. As far as I knew, he had never worked for Kodak himself, but it was just sense that it's like, wow, we're losing part of this like great essence to this community. Grant you, this is like 2000, like 15 or so, or 16, and it's just like Kodak. You can still see all of its impact on the community. I mean, I was also like reading some stuff too, and I remember it was like when this one building came down, like people were crying. People who had been burned by Kodak chemicals in the past, because it's like, wow, this is so sad to see this thing go. And I think that's what's really important to understand, that Rochester, New York was a company town. This just wasn't just like any like 9 to 5 job that you go to, but it was like so deeply embedded into the community, which made the crimes of Kodak environmental justice wise, so much more devastating. Kodak, in fact, the reason Kodak started to become unpopular was because of its environmental, crimes. In 1988, there was a methyl chloride pipe spill. 30,000 gallons ended up leaching near a elementary school, just a few hundred yards away from, where the little elementary kids' schools would go to school. And if that wasn't bad enough, the next year there was a giant vapor cloud. 3 miles of the entire city were covered. The highways were shut down. Kids had to go home from school. People were told, do not go outside. People got injured. And while I'm sure Kodak had plenty of environmental issues before, 1988, when they had their pipe spill and everything, it's kind of hard for the community to ignore when you have, your kids are being exposed to chemicals at school, or you can't go outside because it's a giant vapor cloud, so you can't really see anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, it's not just the environmental that we start seeing this decline of Kodak in the late 1980s. We also see that the workers start going. So between 1984 was kind of like the last year of the hype. So really, Kodak had its glory years from the late 1970s to the early 1980s,
Mm-hmm.
and then beginning like 1984, the workers start going. So it's not just, granted, you have your environmental issues in the late 1980s, but you also have these worker layoff issues. So we see 18,000 workers laid off in a period of 6 years, which is just huge. And 18,000 workers being out in just in Rochester, not just worldwide, just in Rochester. I'm sure since Kodak was a global, company, I'm sure there's also plenty of layoffs outside besides Rochester. But I know, like, when we have like maybe 100 people laid off, it makes the news here. 18,000 over a course of 4 years is massive. So you really start to sully people's minds. It's like, well, yeah, we're still a company town, but now like they're like, killing us and killing our kids with chemicals, and we're no longer getting a job, and then things just keep spiraling.
Let me ask you a question about that, because that's interesting. So Kodak spent all this time, I'm assuming all these resources, to make itself part of this community. They were able to kind of gain the favor and gain the appeal of people that lived there, and people spoke highly of Kodak. And so when these things started happening, from your understanding, did the community members themselves or the elected officials, mayors, city council, did they have any ability or any type of influence on how Kodak responded to these environmental concerns and issues that were now visible? Did they have any input into the ways in which they were managing the workforce, laying off so many people so quickly? Like, what did the community get to do in terms of allowing itself to be protected or insulated, or at least have a voice into what Kodak was doing? Because they were clearly a major player in the city, and with community support and backing, they were able to grow the way they did. So when these things start happening, how did the community respond to it, and how were they able to have any impact on what Kodak did during this time?
So I think there's two different groups to look at. So you have, like, I would call it like your average citizen, and then you
Mm-hmm.
also have like the city council that you referred to. The average citizen, they did form environmental, like, coalitions. They formed associations, neighborhood groups, all saying we don't want, like, not like we don't want Kodak, but we want Kodak to clean up its act, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We want them to treat us properly. And it was also this pent up thing too, because often these communities kind of knew that they had been exposed to unfair chemical, like, undue burdens, and now it's like, now we have this opportunity, because now it's everybody knows that we have an issue. So I think back, it's like they had like days of action. It was like, okay, nobody go buy Kodak cameras. We're boycotting them, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, city council, from what I can tell, it was just more like, oh, here's a fine, slap on the wrist, kind of thing. It's like, well, some of them probably, I obviously can't say this for certain. I'm sure some of them probably got their election campaigns partially funded by Kodak, kind of
Of
thing.
course, of course.
So it's really more like it's the citizens. And then also the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation starts getting involved as well.
Mm-hmm.
So things start happening on the state level. They start doing more audits and stuff. And the audits, what they do, reveal huge issues that, yes, Kodak does take some steps, to want to make themselves look better after the audit, but it's not like, it's not great. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
you have all these issues on the audit, you can try to fix it, but it just shows you that you didn't care enough to, in the first place, to make sure that these would not be issues.
That's right. I always ask that question because it's in moments like these, when you have these environmental catastrophes, that you actually get to see how much a company or corporation truly cares about the community that they say they're serving, the people that they say they support who work there. I mean, we know from the beginning when you talked about all the benefit that the workers got from the company. I'm assuming they still continue the insurance, the dividends, those really important compensatory elements of the job. But now, if you're exposing your workers to chemicals, if you're exposing the broader community to chemicals, their children, the small children, now the response gets to show us, hey, Did you really care all along or not? Or was this all just a part of your kind of business strategy to grow and develop as a corporation? And so I wonder during that time how much Kodak was willing to engage the community, these community groups, how willing they were to take proactive steps to try at least to clean up what they were destroying, because obviously they're very profitable. They're growing rapidly. I imagine the layoffs were part of their decline as well. And so you can talk more about that in a second. But do you get the sense that Kodak as an organization had a desire to clean up these messes and to serve the community better? Or were they really just trying to push as much as they could off and continue to grow and profit as a corporation?
I would say they were trying, if you will, like placate the community. So, for example, like the smoke from the smokestacks would ruin like the finishes on people's cars. So they would like, okay, we'll repaint your car for you. Okay, I guess you don't have to do that. It's nice of you, but you're not fixing the issue.
Right.
And I think ultimately, and now here's where some of my bias might come in. I feel maybe perhaps in the early, 1900s, maybe mid 1900s, they cared more. But over
Hmm.
time, you start to see it's more of the sense of it's like we're all about the money. The CEO is caring about, I guess, like the stakeholder,
Right.
investments, and that's where
Hmm.
we start to see it happening. It's a now maybe just because it's me. I'm from Rochester, New York, and I had this sense that also like Kodak was this great company that we all should be thankful for in a sense because that's the reason the city was kind of founded, perhaps. So I do admit that, but I ultimately do think that it was just a sense of like well, we'll kind of skirt by. We'll, do some placating of the community. We'll show up to some meetings. We'll say we're going to do better. Well, we'll improve on our audit standing. Oh, look, we did great. Let's publish this in the newspaper. We did fantastic. Let's talk and put an article out there about how we're renewing our commitment to the global environment and how things are doing great, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And part of me is just kind of like, this is just like, the early version of greenwashing, where it's like we're doing all these great things for the community and for the environment. Oh
Hmm.
look, we updated the the scrubber technology on our smokestack. Yay! Everybody clap! News conference. Meanwhile, it's like now please ignore the other like 40 skeletons in the closet that we're trying to hide.
Hmm. Hmm. No, that makes perfect sense. And so I could imagine that. And I guess a lot of corporations are like this, right? When they're founded, they're smaller, they're more community driven, kind of mom and pop styled, way of engaging the public. And as it grows and as different people come in, maybe younger people, maybe more business minded people start looking for ways to increase profitability, increase, shareholder value, increase all these different things. And in the meantime, the community gets pushed to the side. Regulations they've always been, taught bad about by corporations as a hindrance to growth. And so that could be another thing too. And so I imagine over time it just became more and more detrimental to have them around. And so it gets to a point where Kodak actually starts declining in value and standing. Obviously, the community support is waning because of these environmental catastrophes and these spills and these leaks and all of this exposure. And then the layoffs come. Tell us more about what happened to Kodak. What happened to them?
Yeah. So we continued this sense of decline through the 90s, and then in 2012, in January, so first month of the new year, they declare bankruptcy, and then they start basically, in a sense, I would say restructuring the company, cutting their losses, sort of thing. And at this point, Kodak cameras are obsolete, if you will. So part of the
Mm-hmm.
reason Kodak started to fade in the first place is yes, one, because of all those environmental issues they were having, all these externalities, if you will. They were not considering all the harm they were doing to the environment. But I would say probably the bigger issue that drove them out of business was their business plan. So Kodak saw itself as this chemical company. Okay, people are gonna love film forever. People are gonna like embrace digital photography. And so they kept trying to push, the film cameras. Yes, they did get into the digital photography realm. In fact, some of the earliest digital cameras were actually concepts of their own design. But
Mm-hmm.
it was like, we don't want to let go of our past as this, film, chemical, photo developing company. And so they made some investment choices, they made some, research choices, and they decided to continue down the film route. And unfortunately, that's kind of what killed them. Because I mean, think about today. Everybody got their cell phone. There's digital
Mm-hmm.
camera in there. We don't. People, I feel like, rarely ever use film cameras anymore. Unless it's like, oh, I want to go play with my Polaroid or something, or unless you're like an actual, like, very professional photographer who's using film for some kind of look or austere or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just slow decline, which is like many times in life, but it was a decline that could ultimately be seen coming just because of all these poor business choices that were being made and environmental choices being made.
Mm-hmm.
So that ultimately leads us right to January of 2012. So Kodak, goes under restructuring. There are some Kodak spin-offs today that still exist, but it's very, I would say, like specialty. So it's like we've specialized in like film discs. So like they used to play movies back on way in the old days, very like specialized stuff. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
it's still it may be under the name of like it may be like some Kodak long name kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really Kodak anymore. It's some like weird spin-off that has very little to do with Kodak besides, it has to do with film. It's still in the original location that Kodak was. Instead, what has Kodak's giant manufacturing facility that was, and I believe still is, the largest photographic manufacturing facility that was ever built, that became home to a bunch of different companies. So, yes, some of them are Kodak spinoffs, but some of them are like more established companies, and some of them are startups. So, I know like previously we talked about how Rochester is home to a bunch of startups. So, a bunch of startups have moved in, and they're starting to use like the technology that Kodak left behind. Sure, you got to adapt some of it, but the foundation is good. The foundation is there to be making some stuff. And then for the established companies, we're looking at DuPont. We're looking at big company that I feel like we all hate with good reason. And then there's also companies like Harris Corporation, or also known as L3 Harris. So they make like radios for the military. They do some like missile guiding systems, things like that. So unless like you're super into military, you're probably not super familiar with them. Or like companies like Ortho Clinical Diagnostic. So they're a spinoff of Johnson and Johnson. So think like the Johnson and Johnson COVID vaccine. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so they make a lot of medicines. And I think oftentimes when we think, okay, so they left all this infrastructure behind. So then something else has moved into it. So ultimately, these companies, Harris Corporation, DuPont, uh, also Clinical Diagnostics, there's even a semiconductor company that's moved in there. It's taking advantage of the stuff that Kodak left behind.
Mm-hmm.
That was left behind in Kodak Park. Now, here's where I do have to say that Kodak Park officially does not exist anymore. They have changed the name. That being both Kodak and also the city as well. So Kodak Park today is now Eastman Business Park, which when we think about business parks, it sounds like, oh, a bunch of offices for the CEO, a nice suite, maybe a massage chair. And yes, I would say that there is some of that in there. There is some nice office spaces available for rent. Um, but there's also manufacturing going on there. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just like oh, bougie chairs. It's also manufacturing. But this name change make it sound like, oh, now we're into like no more environmental harm because we're not really producing anything. We're just, being the corporate level.
So, okay, there's a lot there. So, Kodak Park is no longer officially in existence. And so, you've talked a lot about how the kind of facility infrastructure and the operations of Kodak and what it became once it went bankrupt, how that's changed over time. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Kodak's bankruptcy impacted the community as a whole, the Rochester, New York as a city? Because it feels like a lot of the people that lived there really relied on what Kodak offered, relied on those jobs. I'm sure the contributions from Kodak to the general public, I'm sure there were other, donations made. You talked about how they supported the struggling university there, the School of Music. Like, it's really a big part of this community that if I wasn't paying attention, I would believe that maybe all of that gets lost once Kodak is no longer in existence. And maybe, I don't know if things collapse in terms of their ability to sustain themselves. I don't know if the donations dry up and things have to change their names or things shutting down around the town, because a lot of the discussion about the impact of corporations is that they also do contribute to the general fabric of a society. And then without them, that's what they would tell us, right? Without them, you would lose a lot of that input and a lot of those resources. And so, what would you say potentially has changed community wide when Kodak went out of business, went bankrupt?
The truth is, I would say because it took so long for them to decline, there was time for, I would say, adaptation. People started to see them falling down maybe 20 years prior to when it was happening. So people adjustments started being made. The Yoko universities, some of them that Kodak founded, like Rochester Institute of Technology, started like, okay, like we're going to start preparing people for careers that might be perhaps of use to Kodak, but would also be great. They could also really work for startup communities.
Mm-hmm.
The medical school, with like they kept pushing out doctors. So I feel like the impact, because it was such a slow burn, if you will, was not huge. But I also want to be cognizant that the impact was also huge in many people's lives. For example,
Mm-hmm.
retirement plans. If your pension came from Kodak, it's gone. Kodak basically said, because you went bankrupt, we don't have to honor your pension agreement anymore. You are pretty much left without your retirement savings that we promised you for all those years, essentially.
Wow.
So then and then you have a bunch of people like, well, I'm 60, I'm 70, what do I do? Okay, now I gotta go back to work. So then it's like, and the problem is, okay, so they've all been trained in film, which is now kind of, dead, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So we're like, okay, I can't do that. And also, when you're 70, I mean, sometimes, you're not the most physically fit person, not the most spry person, if you will. So you can't be doing like a manual labor job that perhaps you were doing at Kodak. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
now you're stuck, driving the bus. And there's nothing wrong with driving the bus, but you worked hard for your retirement. There's a sense of also like unfairness that you've been left high and dry.
That's
And
right.
then,
That's right.
and then I also talked about like Kodak pay people a lot of money. So now you're probably going to pay maybe a third of what you were making at Kodak, just because, you were in skilled labor, and now, well, driving a bus is skilled. You do need a certain license for that. You're not making as much anymore. So I think there's a sense that like it really, really hit individual people super, super hard. But the community as a whole was able to like kind of like spring back, if you will, and head in this other direction, this like startup direction, which is what a lot of the businesses in Kodak Park today are in fact startups that this like downfall of Kodak has helped to spur and to bring about.
That is interesting. I mean, you read a lot of stories about how when manufacturing leaves a town or when a large industry leaves a town, like the town can die, right? The people don't have the jobs, they don't have insurance, they don't have those pensions, those guarantees, or not even the training, because all of their training was wrapped into the one job that they did for that corporation, for that facility, and doesn't translate well. And so it's interesting to hear how Rochester was able to kind of pivot and still maintain its relevance and maintain its sense of self as it moved away from Kodak as it was declining, and allow for these startups and other entities to come in and continue to, at the very least, provide opportunities for people who wouldn't have had them otherwise without Kodak being there. So that's an impressive story that I hope people listening can really appreciate, because that is not a common occurrence. And in many instances, even on a federal level, we propose these ideas of, bailing out corporations, bailing out large entities on the fact that without them, those communities may not exist in their current form and not be able to sustain themselves. And so Rochester clearly could serve as a way of moving through a situation where you were so reliant on one particular employer to then transitioning to being able to still support your community with the wide variety of options, good, strong universities, great opportunities. And so it's a testament to Rochester's resilience and ingenuity that they were able to continue to be who they were without this large embedded corporation in their midst. And so that is very, very interesting. And so we are running out of time, but before we go, tell us what tell us what you really think about the situation with Kodak, because I know you're a college student, right? You're very analytical, well-researched, well-read. You understand the issues, you articulate them very well. But for you personally, being from Rochester, seeing how things have changed, knowing people who have grown up there, knowing people who've been impacted, seeing the fallout from some of the things that they've done, how do you feel learning all these things, seeing all these things, experiencing all these things?
How I feel? I mean, it's mixed. It's the sense of, for one, I feel like we traded Kodak is for another large employer, if you will, which is now the University of Rochester Medical, I guess, facility company, if you will. I feel like every single week I see a new urgent care springing out around town. I feel like, in a sense, we've just traded one, perhaps, villain for another. Though, granted, I don't know everything about there is to know about, the large medical company. So I feel like, in a sense, we're just transitioning to something new. It's a new name, it's a new face. But in a sense, I also do feel, I guess I would say it's also like strange to be proud of it. It's like I can say my town is known for something. My town is known for Kodak. My town is known for Xerox. My town is known for Bausch and Lomb. Because I feel like a lot of people, especially like when I go to college, it's like, hi, I'm from, what's the town? Oh, Ashtabula, Ohio. What is famous in that city? Not a clue. There's not much at all. But the thing is, I can be like, wow, look at all these great names that have come from my company. Have come from my town. In addition, like, also, like, for example, like, the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote the North Star when he was in Rochester. Look at that. We have famous people. Susan B. Anthony, the women's, voting convention also happened, like, in Seneca Falls, which is right near Rochester. So I'm like, hey, look, I'm from somewhere important and famous. And I feel like we all want to be from somewhere that's, famous, not like a little, like, rinky-dinky town that no one's ever heard of. But in the same sense, you also feel it's like we're famous also because of the wrong reasons. Look at all this harm that has happened to us. People nationwide, especially when Kodak was, in full steam at its height, knew of Kodak, yes, as the camera company, but also as the company that was killing the town it lived in through all its, photography chemicals and through all its just environmental neglect.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the sense it's also very conflicting because you also know that Kodak continues to sponsor like scholarships for nearby universities, and the price of universities through the roof. And they also sponsor things back in the day as well. A lot of the scholarships are like the George Eastman Scholarship, for example, because he was such a great philanthropist to the community. So then also you're like, it's kind of nice at the same time, and it's just really like I don't know what to like make of it. I also do at the same time you feel bad that like Kodak has also like ruined all these people's lives in the sense that it's like they don't really have the proper skills to, perhaps find another job. Some of them do. And while it's true that the economy has done a really good job in transitioning, some people are always going to be left behind. And when that kind of happens, and it's like you feel terrible for them, especially for some of the older folks who, they were retired, now they're trying to figure out what they want to do. And in the sense that this also carries down through the generations. And part of the reason we've been talking about Kodak on legacy environmental justice in a series on this podcast is because of its legacy. It's not just, oh, Kodak's gone, issue solved. We still have all these impacts. And it's just like, you can see all like the structural foundations of harm that have just been built over the years. And yes, some of them are like kind of crumbly, but they're still there and people are still being impacted. Families are still in this cycle of poverty because part of the reason is because of what Kodak has done. Maybe Kodak, they had an explosion at the plant. They had a bunch of workers die. Okay, so now families have lost somebody. It's this whole like, I'm very conflicted about what to make of Kodak. And I hope my kind of mad ramblings all over the place have made sense. But it's like, yay Kodak, and also like boo Kodak, and it's like, well, and it's like, how do I balance these really really conflicting feelings? Yes, I am glad that Kodak is done, polluting the Rochester, New York like it did. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that a lot of things were lost when Kodak left. So it's like, it gets back to this issue of legacy environmental justice. We're happy the factory is gone. We're happy the community, does not have to face this active like environmental injustice, all this polluting going on. But we recognize that their end is not the end for us. It's just simply a new chapter in this book. So
that's good. That's very good. I imagine a lot of people had that same kind of visceral, conflicting view when they think about a place like Kodak, especially with the way that it initially engaged the community, the way it brought people in, the way it supported so many people that worked there and lived there, and then to see it kind of devolve into what it became and to do the damage it's done and to not be there. I can imagine it'd be a very difficult thing to try and describe in the words. And you're right. We're here because the fact that the Kodak facility is no longer currently actively operational doesn't mean that the environmental injustices have ceased and that the people who have lived there and who currently live there are not still currently dealing with those impacts. And so we are going to talk about that on our next episode. So for everybody listening, please stay tuned for that. It's going to be a great conversation. We dig deeper into this idea of legacy, environmental justice, and we do it looking at Kodak, and we do it with our good friend Savannah. And so just to sign off, Savannah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights, for your research, for your passion, for those mad ramblings. We want more of those on each and every episode. So thank you so much for being on the podcast with me.
And thank you for having me, as always.
Absolutely. And so this is the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. We'll see you next time.